Well, the milestone figure for the world cases now are 25 million, over 25 million officially confirmed diagnosed cases. So welcome to this video, just to hopefully a briefish update today, but there's some interesting things that are going on we should really talk about. So let's a bit from Europe, a bit from the United States, and a bit what's going on generally. But I want to start off with something that's really quite interesting that I've had a lot of correspondence about. So first of all, these are the global cases here, over 25 million now. Or to put it another way, 1 million new cases every 4 days since mid-July is the increase in cases, and the deaths, of course, are now we expect well over 1 million. The actual figures. Now, what I've had so many messages about is saying, well, isn't this just like another influenza? Isn't COVID-19 just like another influenza pandemic? Why are we worrying about it so much? And that's an interesting comment, and it's one that I'm going to address now. So, annual deaths linked to influenza. Now, this is World Health Organization data. Now, I know the World Health Organization hasn't performed that well during the COVID-19 pandemic, but they still have a lot of specialists in different subjects, so I do still trust their data on other conditions. So I don't want to discredit the World Health Organization altogether, because they do have brilliant people working for them, of course. So annual deaths linked to influenza, that's simple flu in other words. Now 3 to 5 million severe cases a year, people that are severely ill every year. And the deaths from influenza every year vary quite a lot. So round about the 300,000 mark to the 650,000 mark for a year where there's more influenza around. So they are the deaths. Remember, that's deaths. So influenza deaths, when there's a fair influenza outbreak, which we could really only describe as a pandemic, that's deaths every year. So they're the way the deaths vary from influenza. Compared to the deaths from COVID, which officially diagnosed are 842,000. Now, having said that, these figures are almost certainly underestimates, because we know that many people die, especially in poorer areas, who are not formally diagnosed. So every year there's people dying from influenza that aren't diagnosed as dying from influenza. We don't know how many because they're not on the figures, of course, but it is a huge problem. So basically there's a pandemic every year from influenza, and it's a very valid point. So deaths so far from COVID-19, deaths from a bad influenza year. That's kind of the magnitude of the difference. But of course, the COVID-19 is not instead of influenza, it's as well as influenza. And the World Health Organization comment: the effects of seasonal influenza epidemics in developing countries are not fully known. So they're saying they simply don't know, not fully known. And this is a severe indictment on us all. 99% of deaths in children under the age of 5 with influenza-related lower respiratory tract infections are found in developing countries. Now, what does this mean? What this means is that children, well, anyone really, but children especially that die of influenza very often don't die of the influenza, they die of complications of that. Now, thankfully, there are remarkably few deaths in young children from influenza in the UK, in the United States, in Western advanced countries. But 99% of the deaths that do occur in children are occurring in the poorer areas of the world with less healthcare infrastructure. So 99% of the deaths in children under the age of 5. And that implies to me that 99% of these children could be saved with appropriate interventions. And this, of course, is an appalling indictment on humanity. It's nothing to do with the COVID-19 influenza. The COVID-19 current pandemic. This is just influenza. This is talking about influenza. Now, interesting data from the 1918 pandemic. Now, this is the black line. I've just taken this from the Wikipedia page, actually. I know I don't normally like Wikipedia, but the entry for the Spanish flu is actually quite good. The 1918-19 pandemic. By the way, no offence to Spain here. The reason it's called the Spanish flu is it started in 1918, when in the United States and England and France and Germany there was all censorship because of the First World War, but Spain wasn't censored. So the first reports of this pandemic came out from Spain. So people wrongly assumed that it spread from Spain. Almost certainly, very probably, not quite sure, it arose in the United States, in chickens in the United States, and came across to Europe in troop ships. That's what most people seem to think. Anyway, I digress. But the point here is these are the deaths. So this black line here, this is the deaths. So this is the age along the bottom. So lots of deaths in children, especially under the age of 4. Look at a huge number of babies, toddlers, died in 1918-19. Then lower in childhood. Then this spike in young adult life, round about 24, 25 years of age. There's a spike there, presumably because they've got such good immune systems, and they had bad immunological reactions causing severe acute respiratory syndrome. Then, as you would expect, more deaths in older people. So that was the shape, that W-shaped curve of the 1918 pandemic. But this dotted line is interesting. This shows the deaths in other influenza pandemics, not the 1918, not the H1N1. And that shows very low deaths in midlife. More deaths here as you would expect. But look at this appalling death rate from influenza. Appalling death rate from influenza amongst children. And that is the sort of high death rate amongst young children that still occurs in many poorer parts of the world. The reason it doesn't occur in Western countries is because of good surveillance and medical care. The virus is the same because these viruses spread around. They're pandemic influenza A viruses usually. But the difference is medical care of children with respiratory infections and antibiotics, appropriate use of antibiotics. So this planet cannot call itself civilized, in my view, as long as this persists. Now, moving on to more specifically COVID-related material. We've had quite a few protests lately, as you've no doubt seen if you've watched any news at all. Now, Germany, I must say I'm taken aback by Germany. I used to spend a bit of time in Germany. I associate it very much as a country of extreme law and order. But it seems to have gone completely belly up lately in terms of protests. I really don't know what's going on in Germany. It's not the Germany I understand from 30, 40 years ago. 38,000 at a mass rally against coronavirus restrictions, so they don't want the restrictions. Hundreds arrested trying to storm the Reichstag. Now, if you know anything at all about European history, you'll know the importance of the Reichstag because it was burnt by a political party who went on to cause the Second World War in 1933. So the Reichstag has got just huge significance in European history. It means a lot to me. I mean, when I was young, I went to the Brandenburg Gate, and I knew that if I walked underneath it, I'd have got shot. Well, you couldn't. It was all fenced off. I remember the partition of Europe and the hangover of the Second World War. So, to try and storm the Reichstag is more significant than it sounds in terms of European history. So, I can't say I'm happy about it at all. I find that really quite upsetting. That these connotations with what is just the history of our parents and grandparents and the appalling events that happened. Now, these groups in Germany have placards about conspiracy theories, about vaccines. They don't like vaccines, they don't like face masks, and something called 5G, not that I know what that is, but it's bunk. This is caused by a virus. Not even going to waste time talking about that. And London, Zurich, also big protest, huge protest, much the same thing in London, Zurich in Switzerland as well. Now the Washington one was a couple of days ago. That was more Black Lives Matter one. 57 years since perhaps the greatest speech by any modern human being, delivered of course by Dr. Martin Luther King. Still cry when I listen to it, I'm sure you do. 57 years after that. But the mass protest, it's not the time for mass protests. Regardless of the cause, I'm not making any comment on the Black Lives issue. But the question I would ask is, all these people there all crammed together, what toilets did they use? What bus did they use to get there? What accommodation did they sleep in? It's not so much these protests. These are outside. It applies to all of these protests. These are outside. Relatively low risk of transmission, but it's all the other stuff that goes on with it. That's the issue. Now, still on global matters. Now, I think that's 13.3 billion. Or 1.3 billion. Because that's how many people are in India. What is that? I think it is. That number, tell me if I'm wrong, I think that number's 1.53 billion. That's how many people there are in India. I sort of wrote it out just to emphasise it, really. Country continues to open up. New Delhi subway is open. Subway, of course, is a rapid transit system, not a sandwich store. Do you call them sandwiches in the States? We call them sandwiches in England. Anyway, cases greatly increasing in India. Now, that is the greatest increase of any country in any 24-hour period ever. So that's a world record, not the sort of world record we want, but that's what it is. Indian deaths still relatively low according to the official figures, but exponential rise in many parts of India. Now, the new cases in places like some of the big metropolitan areas like Mumbai and New Delhi does seem to have levelled off, but it's spreading into the countryside now in India, where healthcare is often very difficult at the best of times. Moving on to France, Tour de France is now on. One of the greatest sporting events in the year, in my view, the greatest feats of athleticism perhaps ever in human history. They just go on day after day. It's amazing. A team with 2 positive results in its entourage will be expelled, meaning that they might try and not admit that they have cases, although there are testing facilities going around with the tour. Now, just when we're on the French and the European situation, we see that according to the official number of cases, France has 4,668 new cases there per day, which is higher than it was at the peak of the outbreak just before the start of the lockdown. But of course, I think it's very important to look at this in the context of the testing, because now there is a lot more testing being done. So let's just look at that in context of the testing. And here we have the amount of testing that's being done. We see it's much higher. So again, if we look at the number of cases and we compare that to the testing. So now there's more testing. More cases are going to be detected. Now, of course, the real number of cases is always higher than the number of positive tests. But there was relatively less tests being done in March, April. So the actual number of new cases in March, April was probably higher than the number of new cases now. So I think it's important to take that into account. And also, if we look at the situation in Spain, we see something similar. These are the new daily cases now, pretty high numbers. And that was the number of new daily cases at the height of the first wave, what we might now call the first wave of the pandemic. We see that the numbers now are not far beneath that. But then when we look at it in the context of testing, we actually see there's a lot more testing than there was now. So these figures are an underestimate of the actual number of cases. These figures are an underestimate of the actual number of cases. But this is probably a greater underestimate of the actual number of cases. So I'm not saying there's not a dramatic increase in Europe, there certainly is, but we have to take it in context of the increased amount of testing. Now, moving on to the UK, the UK Test and Trace system. And of course, this is pivotal to our success against the virus. We need to test every case. We need to trace every contact. That still remains what I think we should be doing. Now, the NHS Test and Trace system has failed to reach 80% of its target for the 9th week in a row. You would think they would have improved by now, so that is somewhat disappointing. And this is almost amusing, if it wasn't rather tragic. The government's paying social media influencers and reality TV stars to promote this NHS Test and Trace system. Now, who these people are, I don't know. I've never seen them, but it just seems a bit of a strange way to spend government money to me. But there you go. I'm not an administrator. All I know is for sure no one's paid me. The government hasn't paid me, that's for sure. Now, the University and Colleges Union are raising concerns here. As term starts for universities potentially in the next few weeks, in the next week or two, really. The University Colleges and University and Colleges Union, moving 1 million plus students around the country as a recipe for disaster and risk leaving ill-prepared universities as the care homes of a second wave. Well, I hope it won't be that bad. But the point is valid. People moving around the country, of course, is never good during a pandemic. So there is some validity to their concern there. And it's time for the government finally to take some decisive and responsive action in its crisis and tell universities to abandon plans for face-to-face teaching. So that is the concerns of the union for universities, or one of the unions for universities in my country. Now, this next story is just disturbing beyond description, and it's particularly grating because the mainstream media does not seem to have picked up on it, and the protest groups that you would expect to be bouncing up and down about this simply don't seem to be. Now, what seems to have happened here is that there's a lot of African workers in Saudi Arabia and a lot of migrants passing through Saudi Arabia to try and get to Europe. And the Saudi government correctly thought that they would be an infection risk as they're a mobile population. And very often these migrant workers live in very confined conditions, maybe hundreds of people sleeping in a relatively small area. So the concern was justified. But what seems to have happened, according to this from the Telegraph, and this is the only place I found this, they've all been rounded up and essentially imprisoned. It looks like an appalling situation. So this was from the Telegraph investigation. Now, these are not my words; these are from the news outlet, but I thought it was worth putting them in. African migrants left to die in Saudi Arabia's hellish COVID detention centres. This is what this article is saying. Do read it for yourself. It's quite alarming. So the article says hundreds, if not thousands, of African migrants locked in heinous conditions, reminiscent of Libya's slave camps. Now, you probably know the background here. Many African migrants travelling north from sub-Saharan Africa were essentially captured by people smuggling gangs and held in camps in lawless areas like Lebanon and Sinai Peninsula, for example. And were abused to extort ransoms from their relatives. Quite an appalling situation. So they're saying it's reminiscent of that. Now, the drive to stop the spread of COVID-19, of course, is a good one from the Saudi government. But this report saying dozens of emaciated men crippled by Arabian heat lying shirtless in tightly packed rows in small rooms with barred windows. These people basically seem to have been put into these camps where people are concentrated. People have died of heat stroke, and that others are barely getting enough food and water to survive, and the sanitation is also appalling. Now, that part of the world, you might remember the talk a few days ago with Ragad, and she said in Baghdad now the temperature was down to 43. It had been over 50. These temperatures just aren't compatible with life without good ventilation and air conditioning, but that seems to have been the case. This is really points out some of the collateral damage, if you like, of this pandemic. Many have been held in detention since March. There's reports of racial and physical abuse of an extreme nature, it has to be said. Riyadh feared migrants who are often housed in overcrowded conditions would act as vectors for the virus, justifiably. But apparently everyone is sick here, someone said, and has some disease or other. So it looks like these people are mostly men, mostly from, well, all African, mostly from the Horn of Africa. And they just seem to have been forgotten about by the world, and this is just an unacceptable situation. So let's hope these protest groups that are protesting about Black lives and civil rights and things like that start advocating for these grossly abused human beings in these situations. Let's hope the human rights lawyers get on that, and that this has raised attention of it, because I don't see it on the mainstream media. And it's deeply concerning. It's almost as if African lives don't matter, and that is distressing. Especially the scale of what seems to be going on there in Saudi Arabia. Let's move on to the United States now. Well, always interesting things going on. What I've done actually this morning, I was looking through the United States weekly report. They do a good weekly report. So let's look at these. And this one's particularly relating to hospitalizations. So we see that the number of hospitalizations in the States, these are weekly. So the weekly hospitalizations in the States are much lower. So there was a peak then. That's about, April time. And there was a peak then. That's about June, July time, and now the number of hospitalizations has gone down quite markedly in the States. Now this is interesting. This is the cumulative numbers of different age groups. So this is 65 plus. This is these are cumulative, of course. So the best these lines can ever do is flatten out. These are the age groups. Now, interestingly, can I zoom in a bit there? The quality on the website wasn't very good, which is a bit disappointing, really. But what I did notice here is that the 0 to 4-year-olds here had a higher hospitalisation rate than the 5 to 7-year-olds, albeit thankfully massively lower than the older age groups. But I thought that was quite interesting graphics to look at. I thought we've got another one. Yeah, there was another one I wanted to show you. This one here is really quite. Well, I'll let it speak for itself. This is the age-adjusted COVID-19 associated hospitalisation rates by race and ethnicity. Now, why the American data says non-Hispanic, African, Indians or Alaskan natives bemuses me, because obviously American Indians and Alaskan natives aren't going to be Hispanic, so why they have to put that in, I've no idea. But what this is the rate for indigenous Americans, American Indians or Alaskan natives. This is the rate for black people there, and this is the rate for Latins or Latinos or Hispanics. This is the rate for white people, and this is non-Hispanic, Asian or Pacific Islanders. So massively higher rates for these ethnic groupings of hospitalizations. And this is the last graphic that I found interesting. This must have been last year's influenza outbreak. That's 2018. There must have been a big outbreak then. Slight outbreak in 2019, but these are the percentage of deaths here due to pneumonia, influenza type features, and these ones will include COVID-19. And we see that the death rate is going way, way down now in the United States. But this is the threshold. Is this what they call the epidemic threshold, I think? Yeah, epidemic threshold. Of course, it's higher in winter than it is in summer. So that's where it was in 2018, that's where it was in 2019, that's 2020. But we notice that the numbers are are coming down now quite dramatically, but still above the epidemic threshold. So I thought that was interesting to see. It's always interesting to see this data with a bit of context. So this is the United States. So as we see, the weekly hospitalizations peaked on the 18th of April, week ending the 18th of April. Then there was a second peak the week ending the 18th of July. So they were the peaks that we saw. We saw there those hospitalization peaks then and then. What were they? No, sorry, they were mortalities, but they were associated with hospitalizations. But it's also true that the hospitalizations peaked then at those times. So these were the peak of hospitalizations, April and July. And American Indian or Alaskan natives hospitalized 4.7 times more than white people. Interestingly, American Indians, Alaskan natives and African Americans all hospitalized at this higher rate. But both all those groupings 4.7 times higher than white people. Hispanics 4.6 times higher than white people. So really quite significant racial differences there, and many factors for this, but I still believe vitamin D is a big factor, because we know the majority of black Americans are deficient in vitamin D, and this just doesn't seem to be being addressed. As I mentioned many times, it's a variable that needs to be eliminated, but has not been. Now, 33 states reject testing guidance. Now, this is my words. CDC not looking good. So these 33 states are going to continue recommending testing for people who have been exposed to COVID-19 and have no symptoms. Good. Because the CDC said you didn't have to have one. Now, given that these 33 states have so declared that they're going to carry on testing people that have been exposed but are not symptomatic, whereas the Centre for Disease Control has said if you've been exposed but are not symptomatic, you don't necessarily need a test. Well, you'll only get a test on the discretion of your healthcare provider. These states are carrying on testing. It's made a mockery, quite honestly, of the authority of the Centre for Disease Control. 33 states so far, out of 50 have said, nah, ignoring the advice of the Centre for Disease Control. In my view, rightly, I did express, not concerns, but I expressed a possibility that the Centre for Disease Control might be thinking that people that were exposed might not antigen convert at an early stage, therefore might get a false negative. But of course, in a lot of places, you need 2 false negatives. So really, the Centre for Disease Control has been made a laughingstock by these 33 states, ignoring their advice. Which isn't good, because there's a lot of clever people work at the Centres for Disease Control, but there you go. South Korea has got increasing cases, shows it hasn't gone away. Some more restrictions. Churches and night spots to close. Night spots and the churches and night spots in South Korea seem to have both been drivers of transmission. So that there more of those are closing. In fact, all are closed now, I think. And more schools going back to remote learning. It's not a massive number of new cases, but it is increasing. China has had no local spread for 14 days. All their cases have been imported. And it just shows how well the Chinese have essentially eradicated the infection from their country. We know all about the mistakes at the start, but I believe this data is true. They've had no new cases for 14 days, no domestic transmission for 14 days. Quite amazing. Now, at the start of this video, we expressed concern about India. And of course, the other part of the world that I'm particularly concerned about is South America. So let's just look at Peru as one example. Data collection in South America is laughable. These numbers aren't accurate. They are Johns Hopkins numbers, but we know the real numbers are higher. And we know the excess death rate, unfortunately, in Peru is the highest in the world. So we know there's more people dying in Peru that aren't particularly diagnosed of dying of anything, but the numbers of deaths is greatly higher than normal for the average period of time. In the UK, it's the 5-year average. I'm sure there's similar figures in Peru. So the excess deaths are very high. Hospitals have been overrun. Booming black market in oxygen and home care. They've had a strict lockdown. It's being eased now, but still, this is concerning, of course. Mostly for home care, because people can't get into hospital or are afraid to go to hospital. So that is a bit of review of some of the disturbing things that are going on in the world now. All I feel I can do is to raise awareness of it. Particularly disturbed by that situation in Saudi Arabia, where many, mostly young African men, are essentially being held prisoner and are in appalling conditions. Let's hope someone starts doing something about it.